What have the Bengals and their front office and their coaches said about the tight ends that they drafted this season?
I think they're excited for both guys. Tanner McLachlan later, Erick Hall earlier. Erick Hall profiles as more of a complete kind of tight end. He will be able to line up in line, but they like his athleticism. They like that he has the route running ability and suddenness to beat man coverage and can be a mismatch weapon if he's healthy. And you talk to some of his teammates who happened to be on the Bengals as well. Chris Jenkins and DJ Turner, two Michigan players that ended up on the team, were Erick Hall's teammate before he transferred to Iowa. And they said that, going back to college, they thought he was special. And then the injuries kind of pile up, and he goes to Iowa, where he missed half the season with that ACL injury last year, but was still Iowa's leading receiver, which tells you just how
Iowa.
dreadful Iowa's offense is. And you go back to Sam Laporta and how Sam Laporta's stats were kind of challenging to evaluate. And then I wasn't very high on Sam Laporta because the offense kind of disguised how good he was, I think, to a large degree. And so that's the hope for Erick Hall, is that he can get healthy for training camp and be able to participate and get ready for the season. I think there's still a chance that he needs to start the season on the physically unable to perform list.
What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
What are the chances T. Higgins gets moved before the 2024 NFL season, as the wide receiver contract market is exploding? And how is Joe Burrow recovering from an unprecedented and unpronounceable wrist injury? Locked On Bengals podcast Jake Liscow offered his deep insights into one of the AFC's hopeful contenders. My name is Joe Dolan. Like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the Fantasy Points YouTube channel for 32 breakdowns for all 32 NFL teams. This is Franchise Focus, Cincinnati Bengals. So what did we learn about Joe Burrow's injury over the last few months after the season, and what's his recovery going like?
His recovery seems to be on schedule by all accounts. The injury is an unprecedented injury for quarterbacks, and if you've heard that, that is true. The scapholunate or scapholunate, I keep confusing which bones it is. Scaphoid certainly involved. I think lunate is the other hand bone involved, so it's the scapholunate ligament, I believe. And it might be the scapholunate, and I'm forgetting my hand anatomy right now. But anyway, it's a small ligament in your hand, in your wrist, and it is crucial for gripping a football. So what happened was, the play before he threw his last pass of the season, he took a hit from Jadeveon Clowney and broke his fall with his hand, and his wrist is in an awkward position, gets bent, and he doesn't think anything of it. He thinks, oh, my wrist is maybe a little bit sore, and then he goes and tries to throw a pass, and he feels his wrist explode. And that's probably doing the final damage that they ended up surgically repairing. But any concern about wrist mobility, about grip strength, those don't seem to be well-founded based on what we've seen from him in OTAs so far, based on what he's doing in the gym in terms of his physical preparation for the season and getting back to lifting. He's been able to do things that require an intense grip in terms of lifting weights and dealing with barbells, dumbbells, stuff like that for quite a while. And he's been throwing for a couple of months now, since late March, and he looks every bit himself, maybe a little bit of rust in the offseason program. Hard to say whether that's, just from a normal offseason gap or how much has been exacerbated by the surgery and the recovery. But it sounds like, according to Burrow, he got through the scary, unknown, uncharted territory part of the recovery and got to a point where now it's just getting things back to normal, knocking off the rust. The big emphasis for him has now been working on off-platform throws. So if you go look at, Bengals social media or Bengals beat writer social media and clips of Joe Burrow throwing in camp, you're going to see a lot of him throwing off-platform, getting on the run and throwing the ball, because that was the next step in his rehab. But you go read the quotes from his receivers or listen to Locked On Bengals when we talked about this in late May. Everyone seems to think he's where he should be. The accuracy is good. The velocity is good. He is, I think, maturing in an important facet, which is acknowledging when he should not push it in practice. Go back to that calf strain last year. He should have acknowledged that either I don't need to practice today, in this first week of training camp when my calf is tight, or I don't need to try to break the pocket and scramble and really push everything to the maximum like he likes to do. That's his general approach. But the evolution of Joe Burrow this year, coming off the calf and now dealing with this wrist, is I need to take a rest when things aren't great, especially in May, especially in, late July, early August, when I have time to recover, because the risk reward just isn't there. And so reportedly, Joe Burrow took a day off from the OTA program in late May at some point. He's not necessarily 100% go, but the rehab and the recovery looks good. The ball is coming out of his hand well, and the mental part of the game is still there for him. The athleticism is still there for him. And if you can just get through the rest of camp healthy, which we've been saying about him, the rest of the offseason healthy, which we've been saying about him really since he came into the league, it feels like. Hopefully this is a year where the schedule and him being healthy leads to a faster start for the Bengals.
So I think the number one thing that the Bengals are getting from Zack Moss in the backfield vis-a-vis Joe Mixon is a lower cap number. But is there something else with the signing of Zack Moss that the Bengals have been saying might fit their offense a little bit better, might be a reason to get a little bit more excited about Zack Moss on the what I believe is a 2-year deal, which is essentially really a 1-year deal for Zack Moss, the new running back?
From a fantasy perspective, is that the angle you're looking
Yeah, I
for?
mean, it's like from any perspective, because I do know that Joe Mixon struggled to run out of the shotgun, which is something that they really like to do. But from a fantasy perspective, I do want to break down Moss's fit and also how maybe Chase Brown is going to fit into this rotation as well.
Yeah, I think what you're going to see is more of a running back by committee approach. So I don't know how comfortable I would be spending premium assets on either of the potential Bengals running backs, those
Yeah.
being Chase Brown or Zach Moss, just from a fantasy perspective. But from a scheme fit perspective, you can make an argument that Zach Moss is more comfortable and more adept to running out of the gun. Maybe has a little bit more wiggle than Joe Mixon at this point in his career, who Joe Mixon, still a hard runner, still would flash that power, flash that acceleration that made him so good early in his career with Cincinnati, but an inconsistent pass blocker and an inconsistent runner for the Bengals, where sometimes he is too easy to tackle. And the Bengals are hoping that Zach Moss provides just more consistency, I think, in those areas, is better at getting downhill, is a better fit for the kinds of things they're looking to do in the running game. Whether or not he achieves that fit, I don't know if that's something I'm comfortable projecting yet, before we see training camp and before we see pads come on, before we see any of what they're doing in the preseason or what they're moving toward in the running game, because they're so experienced now with this coaching staff, with every running concept you can have in football, from the outside zone foundation of Zach Taylor's playbook and Sean McVay experience, to the more gap scheme stuff they've pivoted to in years past when the outside zone wasn't working, more of an inside zone team, more of a shotgun team. I do think you'll see the Bengals get under center a little bit more this year, and that might be where you see the Chase Brown involvement. Last year for Chase Brown, it was a lot of designer runs, the wind backs and the counters, where there's not as much mental work to do for the rookie. They tried to take some of that off his plate and just let him use his athleticism, because he is very fast. He's an explosive player. But I think that Zach Moss, again, they're looking for consistency in the run game, making good decisions, being efficient. That they are looking for efficiency in the run game. They're looking for consistency in pass protection, and they're going to throw the ball a lot. That's still going to be the identity of this football team. And I think one of the bigger questions for these running backs is which is going to emerge as the receiving back, because that is somewhere where Joe Mixon has been, I think, a little bit better than given credit for, even by Bengals fans in recent years. And they will need to replace that productivity. And hopefully that's Chase Brown, with his ability to turn, short touches into explosive plays and use that long speed. The second fastest, I think, ball carrier in the NFL, according to Next Gen Stats in 2023, and giving him those opportunities could yield some more explosive plays for this offense if he can put the rest of his game together.
So you mentioned you don't want to spend premium assets on either one. Well, the good news is if you're looking to invest in the Bengals backfield, you really don't have to spend
That's
premium
good
assets.
news.
Zach Moss right now on Underdog Fantasy, which is where the best drafts are going down. Code Fantasy PTS, by the way. He's going in about the in the 8th round. Meanwhile, Chase Brown is going in the 10th round, and I think those are both completely reasonable. And from what you're saying, if Chase Brown can maybe become the receiving back, he might end up being the more valuable of the two from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, depending on your fantasy rule set, of
Yeah,
course. I again am not terribly bullish on either of the Bengals backs this season. I am also a little bit divorced from things like ADP at this point in my life. I've
completely
had
fair.
to take a
That's what I'm
step
here for.
out of like the nitty gritty of fantasy and min maxing drafts and stuff like that, and trying to figure out roster maximization. So I can't speak to that part, but I can tell you that like I would take a wait and see approach
Yeah.
for this Bengals backfield this year, just based on the amount of change that I would expect. And you're also going to see, I think, a little bit more 12 personnel from this team, a little bit more under center, like I said, a little bit more under center play action from this team, just with the way the roster texture has changed, the departure of Tyler Boyd and things like that. So how that impacts the running game remains to be seen.
So the Bengals have obviously spent a lot of draft picks over the last number of years at the wide receiver position, and they obviously took Jermaine Burton in the third round this year, really good deep threat. But they also had a couple of picks at wide receiver in 2023, and Andre Yoshivach flashed a little bit when they had injuries at the position. How do you see that battle for like the number 3 wide receiver shaking out? As you mentioned, Tyler Boyd has left the team.
Yeah, I think that what they're looking for is for who's going to play those slot snaps. So you're going to see Jamar Chase work in the slot a little bit more. You're going to see Mike Gesicki, who they signed as a tight end, but really everybody knows Mike Gesicki is more of a receiver than a tight end, maybe taking 15 to 20% of his snaps attached to the line of scrimmage in the last few years. He's going to play in the slot for the Bengals a fair amount. And then it's going to be Charlie Jones and I think Jermaine Burton and probably Trenton Irwin mixing in to fill the rest of those snaps. Now, will any one of those guys be trustworthy? I think way too early to tell. What the ideal case would be for the Bengals, I believe, is that either Jermaine Burton or Charlie Jones takes that job and runs with it. Charlie Jones was the earlier pick than Andre Yosivach, who you mentioned last year, but Yoshi, as he's affectionately nicknamed, is working outside. He's not working in the slot really at all in this part of the offseason program. He himself has commented that he doesn't expect to really be part of that slot receiver competition. So he's probably going to continue to be behind Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. You might see occasional 4 receiver sets, but Andre Yosivach is more of a depth piece from that perspective, where the only way I think he sees significant playing time this year is if there is an injury to one of their starting outside guys. They're going to want to have T. Higgins and Jamar Chase on the field together as much as possible. And then it comes down to which of those guys can run away with the slot job. Charlie Jones played outside in college, but has the build and athletic ability where it has a shiftiness. He has the speed, but he doesn't really have the size to play outside, the strength to play outside. But being as he played outside in college and was a late breakout, it took him a transfer and it was really a final year, 1 year wonder kind of player in college. The transition to the slot for him in the NFL took some time, and it took him a pretty big adjustment period that I don't think the Bengals were expecting. Whereas Yosivach, coming out of an Ivy League school, was expected to need time, and he was more ready than they expected him to be, which is why you saw those contributions last year. So you might see some red zone work for Yoshi, but I think if you're looking for the wide receiver 3 on the Bengals, it's a mix of a bunch of guys. And at this point, as we're talking in late May, early June, I think it's just too early to figure out how that's going to shake out with the rookie learning curve for Jermaine Burton, how Charlie Jones evolves from a pretty tough, I think, adjustment to the NFL in year 1, whether he takes that step or not, and how Mike Gesicki plays into that role as well, where I do think he'll eat into the slot snaps for the Bengals quite a bit. So again, outside of those 2 clear weapons for this Bengals offense, I think that there's a big rotation and a big snap share occurring for this team as they try to fill the depth spot for Tyler Boyd, where they wanted him on the field a bunch when he was on the team, and now they're replacing him with a number of different players in different scenarios.
The tight end position for the Bengals has been kind of like the defense against the dark arts teacher at Hogwarts. Like they just cannot keep one, or for if they feel like they have one, the guy gets hurt. You mentioned Gesicki already, but then Drew Sample's more of a blocker, and then they spent 2 draft picks on the position this offseason, including a really interesting guy in Erick out of Iowa. He's dealt with a ton of injuries, obviously dating back to his time at Michigan, but a really talented player. What have the Bengals in their front office and their coaches said about the tight ends that they drafted this season?
I think they're excited for both guys, Tanner McLachlan later, Erick earlier. Erick profiles as more of a complete kind of tight end. He will be able to line up in line, but they like his athleticism. They like that he has the route running ability and suddenness to beat man coverage and can be a mismatch weapon if he's healthy. And you talk to some of his teammates who happened to be on the Bengals as well, Chris Jenkins and DJ Turner, two Michigan players that ended up on the team, were Erick Hall's teammate before he transferred to Iowa. And they said that, going back to college, they thought he was special. And then the injuries kind of pile up, and he goes to Iowa, where he missed half the season with that ACL injury last year, but was still Iowa's leading receiver, which tells you like just
That's
how
Iowa.
dreadful Iowa's offense is. And you go back to Sam Laporta and how Sam Laporta's stats were kind of challenging to evaluate. And then I wasn't very high on Sam Laporta because the offense kind of disguised how good he was, I think, to a large degree. And so that's the hope for Erick Hall, is that he can get healthy for training camp and be able to participate and get ready for the season. I think there's still a chance that he needs to start the season on the physically unable to perform list. And Tanner McLachlan, we haven't seen anything from yet, either in the offseason program, as he's coming off a core muscle repair and he hasn't participated in practices yet. But if you're looking for a dark horse for Bengals tight end production, if there is an injury that leads to Mike Gesicki not being on the field as much as expected, or it just doesn't work with Gesicki the way that it just didn't work with Irv Smith last year, and between injuries and Joe Burrow not getting time with him, and the eventual changes to the offense between Burrow's calf and the eventual quarterback change to Jake Browning after Burrow's injury, Tanner Hudson is the guy that really stepped up and was the per snap basis, the most productive tight end for the Bengals last year. And I think that he does have the trust of these quarterbacks, Joe Burrow, and we saw from Jake Browning late last year. His issue is just that there's not a ton of upside there. But if you're looking for, you got a bunch of extra roster spots if you're in a fantasy league, or you're looking for the dark horse who could emerge as like a free agent pickup kind of thing. If there is an injury to the Bengals tight end room and Tanner Hudson starts to see some play, the quarterbacks do really trust him to take, the underneath stuff or high leverage third down targets if they get open and can convert third downs. They're not going to be like top tier tight ends by any means, but there are some very productive games in Tanner Hudson, and we'll see about the rookies. I'm not too excited about them as rookies. I think that you're going to see typical rookie learning curve stuff for them, especially as they haven't been able to participate in the offseason program this year, but maybe in the future those guys have some talent, and I think that both of them could develop into reliable and productive receiving tight ends in the NFL. It's just a question of timing, I think, and opportunity. And it's hard to see too much of that this year, especially right away early in the season with the injuries they're working with and the suddenly deep Bengals tight end room, which, as you mentioned, defense of the dark arts, or the Bengals just don't want to pay somebody to play tight end for more than a year. They haven't had stability there. You're right about that, outside of Drew Sample, who's not a receiving threat. And so we'll see if anything emerges here. I think they would like to have a long-term asset, and that's where you're looking at Erick Hall, but I'm not sure if Erick Hall is going to be that early impact tight end this year.
We know the offensive line has been a bit of a bugaboo for the Bengals over the years, whether, again, injuries, guys not living up to their contract. What's I don't want to say ideal outcome for Amarius Mims, because we all know what the ideal outcome for Amarius Mims is as a rookie. It's that he comes in and plays incredible and they don't have to worry about him. But what do you think is like the baseline expectation for Amarius Mims, the Bengals first round draft pick?
I don't expect Mims to start right away. I think that will be Trent Brown, assuming that he shows up and is in shape and is ready to go. He hasn't been around for the last couple of weeks, but I don't think that that's anything to really worry about. I know he's still getting work in. He works with Duke Manyweather, the noted offensive line guru in the offseason, OL Masterminds founder, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not like he's not getting work in, but it would be nice probably to see him get work with the team. The silver lining there is that Amarius Mims does get the work with the first team in this offseason program, which is only going to be good for his development. He's been described as a sponge, very eager to learn and absorb coaching. And while he was injured in college at Georgia and he did miss some time, I think the pass protection tape for Mims is really promising as a baseline. So, even if he never puts it all together, I expect him to be a pretty good pass protector in the NFL because he's so athletic and so fleet of foot, especially for a guy who's 6'8", 6'8", 350. I think they want him to get up to 350 instead of 340. He's got 36-inch arms, and it's just hard to get around him, and he redirects well. And so the pass protecting floor for him is pretty high in the long term. And I also expect that they will get the best pass protection at right tackle if Trent Brown is playing all year that they've had in years. Jonah Williams was a fine player at right tackle, but he's not the pass protector that Trent Brown is. Notably works on an island a ton and has a lot of experience on both sides. So for Mims, you hope he's ready to go if and when Trent Brown gets hurt. I think he's played a complete NFL season in 3 out of 8 tries. So you kind of expect that he's going to miss time at some point. So you hope that you don't need Amarius Mims right away, or when you do need him, he's ready to go and at least be caught up from a mental perspective, from a pass protecting perspective, because like I said earlier, the Bengals want to be a pass first team.
His name is Jake Liscow. You can catch him on the Locked On Bengals podcast. He's wearing the headwear of the Locked On Network. Always a great follow. Thomas, that was terrible. I'm going to restart that. That was a terrible outro. His name is Jake Liscow. You can catch his work on the Locked On Bengals podcast. We get a lot of guys from the Locked On Network, and they provide wonderful analysis. And you can follow him on Twitter at Jake Liscow. Jake, it's been wonderful talking to you, and we'll check back in training camp looking at some of those battles.
I appreciate it.